Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And as of late, I've been doing a series on the book of Revelation called The Seven Spirits of Revelation. And today is part 8. So let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, I definitely wanted to go ahead and talk about the seventh trumpet and the two witnesses. Last week, I took a deeper dive into the first four trumpets and mentioned that maybe I would need to do a deeper dive into trumpets 5 and 6, but as was the case last week, that actually ended up being a lot of detail, a lot going on in the fifth and sixth trumpets. So, with that in mind, I went ahead and titled this episode, Part 8, A Deeper Look into the Trumpets 5 and 6, and the little scroll, although I didn't actually even get to the little scroll. There was so much detail on the Trumpets 5 and 6. In a way, it made me think, gosh, am I ever going to be able to finish this series on the book of Revelation, since it keeps on going for so long? But I think establishing the seals and establishing the trumpets is very important, sets the tone for what the vision was about and what the vision will continue to be after chapter 11, so from chapter 12 and on. So this series will take some time to go through, but I think it's been very fruitful and has, alleviated some of the mystery of Revelation, but also brought other mysteries into play. So unlike the first four trumpets, if you look at the first four trumpets, their descriptions are actually quite brief. They really just take place from Revelation chapter 8, verses 7 through 12, I believe. Let me take a look and just make sure that's the case. Yeah, verse 7 is when he sounded the first trumpet, and then at the end of verse 12, that is the end of the blowing of the fourth trumpet. So that's actually very quick. So then the rest of chapter 8 is this interlude. And then the fifth and sixth trumpets are all of chapter 9. So that's a lot of detail and vivid imagery that goes into trumpets 5 and 6. So why is that the case? Why are trumpets 1 through 4 so quick and brief, and trumpets 5 and 6 so much detail? So that's what we will look at today. By the way, I came up with a name for this new view that I am coming up with, that I'm talking about and elaborating. I'm going to call it the covenantal view. I don't know if it'll ever catch on with theologians or anything like that, but I thought I should at least have a name to give it so that I can refer to it. Make it different name than the preterist view or the historicist view or the future view or the idealist view. I came up with this idea of calling it the covenant view because that's what it deals with. It deals with the old covenant and how it transitioned to the new covenant and how the old covenant ended. So this is an overview of the seven trumpets, which we did already, and then last week we talked in more detail about trumpets 1 through 4. So last week, the idea was that trumpets 1 through 4 represented the overlapping covenantal judgment period from the weakening of Israel that occurred between 30 and 66 or 70 AD, depending on whether it goes to, after the war started, but somewhere thereabouts, 66 AD, when the first Jewish-Roman war started. Then you had the small interlude of an eagle flying midair in Revelation 8:13. And then you have trumpet 5, the siege of Jerusalem in the spring of AD 70. Then there's one verse short interlude that just says it's the end of the first woe. The second woes, its next two woes are going to start. And then you have the sixth trumpet, which I believe is the sacking of Jerusalem and the during the summer of 70 A.D., not including the destruction of the temple. That's important. Then you have another small interlude, which is the end of the second woe, and it also starts talking about the rest of mankind, what happened with them. So that's going to be interesting. And then you have this first big interlude. So there's actually two interludes. There's the two witnesses and the little scroll. So the first of this big interlude is the little scroll, and that's Revelation chapter 10. Let's go into detail about Revelation chapter 9, the fifth trumpet. So starting with verses 1 through 3, the fifth angel sounded his trumpet. I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke of a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. And out of the smoke, locusts came down on the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. So one question I thought about was, who is this star? Star usually symbolizes a leader of some sort. And this particular star fell from the sky, fell out of the sky to the earth. And it was given the key to the abyss, and he opened the abyss, and out came smoke from the abyss, and then these locusts. Determining the right emperor or general requires knowing the correct time period, and there's a little bit of a variable as to what the time period is. It's somewhere between 66 and 70 A.D. During that time was the first part of the first Jewish-Roman War. It started in 66 A.D., but then the siege didn't happen until 70 A.D. So a little bit of detail about what happened in this time period, this interim time period. So it started in 66 A.D. with the revolt of Cestius. He had a failed campaign. There was Jewish revolts that broke out under the procurator Gessius Florus. There was violence in Caesarea, tax issues, sacrilege incidents that spiraled into open rebellion. There was a Syrian legate, Cestius, marched down with this guy, Legio the 12th, and auxiliaries. I guess those are just other side armies. They burned and sacked towns in Galilee and in coastal areas, and then they advanced towards Jerusalem. They briefly assaulted the city, but then Josephus wrote that they mysteriously withdrew, and then they were ambushed and badly defeated at Beth Horon. So I wrote that this is more like a failed Roman swipe than the main locust invasion. This doesn't seem like how you call it, a blow of the trumpet where definitively some sort of judgment of God occurs. There was judgment being poured out, but it wasn't full. It was partial, and it didn't. Although they did start to attack Jerusalem, they withdrew and they didn't finish the attack. So from 67 to 68 A.D. Was Vespasian's big invasion. This was after this disaster of Cestius. Nero appoints Vespasian to take charge. Vespasian is not the emperor at that point. He's a general. Nero is the emperor. Vespasian gathers 3 legions from these 3 areas, plus even some smaller auxiliary armies. And he has a base at this place called Ptolemais. And he launches a full campaign in Galilee in the early part of 67 AD. So there's cities that fell, Populations are slaughtered or enslaved. Galilee and much of Judea are crushed. And then those who aren't killed, those refugees, pour into Jerusalem. And because now there's different types of Jews there, you get, or Jews from different regions of Judea, you get factions that grow increasingly violent. So you get this infighting that happens within Jerusalem. And this is the period 67 to 68 AD. Now, there's a bit of a respite or a pause from 68 AD to 69 AD, and that is because, as we talked about last week, there was a Roman civil war. It was the year of 4 emperors. That was Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian. This guy who was a general at this point, he becomes the emperor at the very end of 69 AD in December of 69 AD. Now, as I'm thinking about this, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of history. I never knew all this about Rome and all these different things that happened. But you do find yourself having to learn more and more details about what happened during this time period in order to understand what the symbols of the book of Revelation represent or how to interpret them. During this time period, Nero commits suicide, and you have this infighting, the civil war within Rome with these 3 different generals who, I think, well, actually maybe Otho was a senator, but these 3 different people. And then finally Vespasian, and Vespasian waits to see how the imperial succession is going to play out before he does anything more in Judea. So he finally is proclaimed the emperor. A lot of people think that Rome was really, the future of Rome was really up for grabs. Lots of different things could have happened. It could have gone different ways, but Vespasian was able to reel the empire back in. So Vespasian now goes to Rome to rule, and then he sends Titus, his son, to finish this war in Judea. So again, I put here that this verse 3 in Romans 9, and out of the smoke locusts came down on the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. That this time period could describe this smoke that is released from the abyss and comes down to earth. Now, if the 5th trumpet then deals mostly with the siege, then I would think that the star would be Vespasian, and then this king, which is referred to later on, would be the general Titus. Now, I will go on to say that the abyss that's talking about here is not necessarily hell or Hades. It's a lot of imagery, vivid imagery that's being described here. And the abyss is just this terrible, bottomless pit that pours out doom and destruction. And the smoke and the sun and moon are darkened. That sounds a lot like Joel chapter 2, which Peter also talked about or quoted in Acts chapter 2. And then also Amos 5, verses 18 through 27. Let's take a look at some of those passages. The overlap of symbols between in the prophets of the Old Testament and what John uses or sees in his vision while he was on the island of Patmos, what we call the Revelation or the Apocalypse. There's a lot of overlap of symbols. And does that mean that they're talking about the same thing? And I think the answer is yes. But it's also possible that the symbols are just common because they're all using this style of writing called apocalyptic style. And really, it's God who's using this style. It is said that the Jewish people came up with this style to describe things, but I think that they actually just used the style, and that God really, as he was giving dreams and visions to people like Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, and Joel and Amos, that they would see these wild, or in Ezekiel, I was just thinking Ezekiel's really important, that they would see this imagery, almost like we watch TV nowadays, that they would see these visions and just write down what happened. And a lot of times in those visions and dreams, an angel would show up and explain at least some of it to them. And that would give us a key as to what these symbols are. When John gets his vision, I believe it's the same thing. He's seeing these visions and he's writing down what he sees. He actually sees locusts that have like the face of people, and that have breastplates and things like that. So I said all that because in Joel chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill." I mean, that sounds a lot like what we're talking about with trumpets in the book of Revelation. "Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, it is close at hand. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, like dawn spreading across the mountains. A large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient times, nor will ever be in ages to come. Before them fire devours, behind them behind them a flame blazes. Before them the land is like the Garden of Eden, behind them a desert waste, and nothing escapes them. They have the appearance of horses. They gallop along like cavalry, with a noise like that of chariots. They leap over mountaintops like a crackling fire consuming stubble, like a mighty army drawn up for battle." So you can read the rest of this, but there's a lot of it goes all the way down to verse 11. It's talking about the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord is not the resurrection of Christ or the death of Christ. It is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And it's a very terrible time. I guess if you first thought of it, the day of the Lord, it's like, yay, let's celebrate, it's coming up. We'll have a big party or something like that. Instead, it's not that. It's a terrible time of judgment for not just the Jews, but the whole human race. That is Joel chapter 2. You can see it's got, I believe it's talking about the same time, and it's definitely using the same symbols. And then right after that, in this next two sections, then that's where you get the part that Peter starts describing as the day of the Lord. After, this is verse 28 of Joel 2, "Afterward I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams." And so that is part of what would come, that would come before the day of the Lord, the day of judgment. That would be what Peter was talking about, came on in Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost. Also, Amos chapter 5, verse 18. This is called, or in the NIV, it's called the day of the Lord. "Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light." That's what I was just talking about, how people might think the day of the Lord is going to be this great thing, but it's actually a great day of doom and judgment. "It will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall only to have a snake bite him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness?" So you can keep on reading this. It goes all the way down to verse 27, the end of the chapter. You can see a lot of the use of this apocalyptic style. Go back to Revelation chapter 9. This is 4 through 6, about these locusts that we're told not to harm any of the grass of the earth. Remember, grass of the earth is Israelites, often it refers to them as the diaspora, but it can be within Judea as well. But they're the ordinary Israelites. They're green, again, because they are the righteous people of God, versus, just yellow grass, which is just regular people. And then it also talks about plants, which possibly is just continuing on with this imagery, but also could be priests that are less prominent than trees. But then it talks about trees. So the trees are the Israelite leaders and the ruling classes, the teachers of the law. It says they were not allowed to kill them. This is verse 5, but only to torture them for 5 months. Now, we talked about how the 5 months is kind of close to how long the siege actually lasted, but that also the number 5 is the number for humanity, or the vulnerability of humanity, the arrogance of humanity, the fragility of humanity. 5 coming from the number of fingers that we have. That was the number for man. And so this idea that man suffered for 5 months, that would be why that number would be used. Let's see, and the agony they suffered was like that of a scorpion. When it strikes during those days, people will seek death and not find it. So a lot of people did die during the siege, as we'll talk about here in the next slide. But during this time, a lot of people didn't die. Those people who didn't die longed to die. It was a terrible, terrible siege. I don't think there was ever a good siege, of course, but this particular one kind of stands out in history, the siege of Jerusalem. They were allowed to do harm to those who didn't have the seal on their foreheads, and that could also be the seal on the forehead. I don't believe this is referring to the sealing of the 144,000. I believe this is a different seal that might be symbolic of the phylacteries that the Jews would wear. But whoever was meant to withstand the full judgment of God, they were not killed, nor were they allowed to escape from Jerusalem. We find in history that this has to be symbolic. We know it's symbolic because whenever we're reading apocalyptic writing, symbols, whenever you read something, it's first you consider it as a symbol, and then only later on do you consider it as literal, or perhaps both. So here, these plants and trees, the green grass of the earth, these are not real things. They are these symbols, as I just explained. And in fact, the actual literal trees and plants were harmed during this time. The Romans, under Titus, he forced his soldiers to cut down every tree around Jerusalem for the siege works and the ramp building that they did. And this circumvallation, this is a word that means the act of surrounding a city, or with a walled city or rampart. And Josephus describes it as an ecological stripping. So the whole land, all the area around this, was the literal trees and plants were harmed. Okay, verses 7 through 11. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. Their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails with stingers like scorpions, and in their tails they have the power to torment people for 5 months. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon, that is, the destroyer. Then you get this first little interlude. The first woe is past, 2 woes are yet to come. So this is just amazingly vivid imagery of the siege. In the winter of 69, going into January and February of 70, Titus arrives with this huge force, 4 legions plus auxiliary armies, bases again at Caesarea. So this is after the Civil War. And in early Nisan, which is the first month of the Jewish calendar, in March or April of AD 70, that's when he moves to Gibeah, establishes a camp on Mount Scopus and the Mount of Olives, which reminds me of Matthew 24, and he begins the formal siege operations. And you see these vivid symbols of the army of Rome. Now, this is a kind of a counterintuitive thing, kind of a fun thing about apocalyptic writing, is that it uses all these symbols. So you see something strange, a color or an object or some sort of thing, item like that, and that is a symbol. But when it says that the symbol is like something else, then it's apocalyptic writing. It's actually being literal. That's very counterintuitive. Usually it's the opposite way. In typical writing, in standard writing, you will say what something is, and then you will say it is like something, and that is the symbol. Here you say it's a symbol, and it's like something that it actually is. So here it says the locusts look like horses prepared for battle. That means the locusts are the horses prepared for battle. The locusts are the riders and the horses. The horses and their riders. That's how I wrote it here. The horses are prepared with armor as well as the soldiers. So the Roman horses had armory as well, especially this breastplate and this nose guard that it had. It talks about that on their heads they wore something like crowns of gold. So that could very well be talking about the shiny brass helmets that they had and the crests that they had of the Roman cavalry. And also just this idea to use the word crown is to symbolize that they operate with God's permitted authority to render judgment. So they had these locusts had faces like human faces. So that means they're humans. They're human riders. And that means that they are intelligent. They're not just instinct-driven insects. They're humans that act with purpose and strategy. So it says it has hair like a woman. I think that's imagery for the manes and the tails of the horses, and teeth like iron. Is symbolic of this animal ferocity that they have, but also these sharp implements of war, the swords and spears, the sound of their wings. So he's seeing these locusts, and the sound of the wings of a large swarm of locusts makes, and this is like, or in this case, because it's apocalyptic writing, is the collective rush and movement of the all these horses with their soldiers on them. Then it talks about the king of the abyss. Verse 11, they had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and in Greek is Apollyon. So this, I believe, is referring to Titus, the general of the army, and he is given this name of destroyer because that is this mandate that God has given him. Then you have the sixth trumpet. I believe this likely starts after the siege. It's kind of hard to draw pieces of time in the symbolism that is Revelation. First, it took a lot of time to implement this wall, this circumvallation around the city. And then once it was complete, then they had to allow the siege to take its course, basically for the food and the water in the city to run out. That's what the point of the siege was to make the target soft by a lot of the people just dying of starvation, and also the fights and infighting that would happen. Just a terrible time. So the sixth trumpet now, it says, verse 13, the sixth angel sounded his trumpet. I heard a voice coming from the four horns of the golden altar that is before God. It said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. The four angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of the mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard the number. The horses and riders I saw in my vision look like this. So again, now he's kind of switched entirely away from just locusts. And I guess the vision started out as locusts, and now that there's this actual destruction going on, he's actually seeing them for what they are. But he sees their breastplates, that the breastplates themselves have symbolism on them, this fiery red and dark blue and yellow that we talked about. The dark blue was symbolic of the smoke, And red, of course, symbolic of war and death. And then yellow also, the destruction of death. The heads of the horses resembled heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and sulfur. So remember, when things come out of the mouth of something in apocalyptic writing, that is the judgment that God has allowed this implement to carry out. The power of the horses was in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails were like snakes having heads with which they inflict injury. So what happened after the siege had taken its course and the army actually broke through, during this time when they were building the walls, things escalate rapidly. Right after the walls are completed, things escalated rapidly into mass crucifixions, starvation deaths, street massacres, and then this final breach and slaughter. They used battering rams and siege engines, which are catapults, and the artillery to assault the walls, aiming to breach them, rather than solely rely on starvation and surrender. So they just use the starvation to soften or weaken the people. Over time, the sections of the outermost walls fell, and the defenses were turned. The defenders on the walls were worn down, and starvation and disease and internal chaos increased inside the city. Then you have the breach of the walls. After heavy use of the siege machines and persistent assault, Roman forces broke through the outer walls, city walls, and the inner defenses, and Josephus records that they penetrated into the city after the initial breaches. Once inside, the fighting reportedly became brutal, and with house-to-house fighting with little mercy. The Romans systematically cleared the city, looting and killing as they went, going all the way up into the temple, but then stopping just for a little bit. Some detail to go into, which I think is part of this symbolism that happens here. It talks about in verse 14, it said to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, this is the sixth angel who just sounded his trumpet, release the four angels. Now remember, number four is this cosmic number of universal cosmic number, which typically means the whole area or a large covering area. And so you have these four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So I believe this is actually referring to the Garden of Eden. And not that there were literal four angels. We know of at least one angel. It says that there were angels that were put at the gates to guard Eden so that Adam and Eve couldn't go back in and maybe eat from the tree of life, and then they would live forever separated from God. So we know that there were angels that were guarding the Garden of Eden that had, the four different rivers, but one of the rivers was the Euphrates that they would know about, at least at this time. And those four angels now, who have been had guarded the tree of life, which the Jews thought was symbolized by the olive tree, that they were kept ready for this very day to come and be released and to wreak havoc on the human race for this decision that Adam and Eve had made to relate to God through obedience rather than through the indwelling Holy Spirit. So you might think that's quite a stretch, but I believe that's what this is referring to. You can read it yourself. The four angels were bound to the great river Euphrates. It could also refer to Abraham and the Abrahamic promise. That also had to do with the being east of the river Euphrates. But nevertheless, what God is talking about in this vision is that there was this judgment that was kept from actually going and destroying humanity until the right time, until the time had come. And that is this time right here, which is 70 AD, August or September of 70 AD, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. all the way up until where the temple was. And that's what we'll talk about next week, as I'm run out of time. Next week, I've already talked about the little scroll and how it represented the Old Covenant. If I were to go into any more detail on that, it would just be to talk about how Ezekiel spoke directly about a little scroll and how it was sweet when you ate it, and how John and the vision he's seeing is talking about that exact same thing. The Old Covenant is coming to an end and is ended here at the destruction of the temple, which I believe is what happened at the seventh trumpet, which is what we will talk about next week. I hope you will join me. Hopefully you're having a good time learning more about Revelation, even if some of these interpretations that I'm giving aren't true or aren't correct, then at least we are learning a lot about the symbols and how God uses them to describe this amazing, vivid imagery of prophecy that is the book of Revelation. Have a great evening. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends so that everybody can hear these different series that I've been putting out. Thanks again.